One of my favourite video games of all time is Donkey Kong Country. Developed by Rareware for the Super Nintendo and originally released in November of 1994, I think it's still a great game to play even today. And the whole trilogy actually. It's fun to set up the old Super Nintendo and replay them again around this time of year. There's something about the colour palette that really gets me in the autumn or Christmassy mood. It was nothing but you, your Super Nintendo and the glow of the TV while it was freezing cold outside. A pretty magical feeling. The third game even included a secret Christmas code. The trilogy had a very outdoorsy sort of vibe and it really lived up to that country moniker in the title. Rare were based in the sleepy English village of Twycross, so I couldn't help but wonder if the British countryside served as inspiration. These are very British feeling video games actually. There was a very sarcastic English wit, and let's be real here, only a British person could make a character design like this. Beautiful. 2024 marks the 30th anniversary of the original Donkey Kong Country, so it just felt like a great opportunity for me to be able to talk about that original game again. So I hope you join me today for a revisit to the original Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country was a high-profile release for the Super Nintendo. It felt like the Sega Mega Drive practically dominated the console market over here, so it was pretty amazing to see Nintendo get much more aggressive with their advertising campaigns. This was a game you just knew you had to have, and it was one of the very first video games I can recall saving up my own money for and buying it myself, and it really did feel like quite a premium package. A full colour manual, I really miss seeing those actually, that's a little bit sad. Even a bonus music CD featuring the most 90s bands you can think of. As soon as you popped your game into the console, you were almost immediately treated to a very cinematic style presentation. Those typical video gamey style HUD elements were practically non-existent. I love how they slowly pull away from the screen after you pick up a collectible. There was a strong emphasis on atmosphere and at times it even felt a little bit unsettling. There was something very engrossing about this silly guerrilla video game, and those graphics really did look incredible, with even the manual making special mention of them. Donkey Kong Country arrived somewhere in between a turning point within the industry. 3D gaming was in its infancy, and there was already a lot of talk as to what the next generation of gaming could really look like. Some were quite convinced that Donkey Kong Country was going to be the future of gaming. I always found the backgrounds especially captivating, believable looking weather effects, such as this raging snowstorm that gradually worsened as you progress throughout the stage. I always loved the stained glass look of the ice caves. And Coral Capers, the first water level of the game, was an utterly breathtaking moment. The sound, atmosphere and graphics all combined together. It just made it feel like you were a part of a nature documentary. Quite unique at the time for a side-scrolling platformer to be set within an almost realistic looking setting. It just felt so different instead of, say, the more surreal locations you would find from a Mario, or the many other platform games of that era. Donkey Kong Country mostly took place within caverns, forests, abandoned mines or lush tropical jungles, and you would usually have to contend with the local wildlife. It just felt a lot more grounded in reality. Okay, maybe I'm just overselling it a little. There are still floating platforms, spinning bananas, bouncy tyres everywhere. This is very much a video game. The Donkey Kong Country sequels did start to feel a little less grounded and lean more towards the fantastical, but nevertheless they still carried such a strong atmosphere. Not just from the environmental details, but an excellent soundtrack mostly provided by David Wise. The music made up such a large part of the experience. But a big part of the game's appeal for me was the character design. It brought back Donkey Kong and just made him look cool again.
Wait, I'll go surfing!
DK's last major appearance prior to Donkey Kong Country was the classic arcade title from 1981, where the character starred as Mario's original nemesis. I mostly identified Donkey Kong as just some old Game & Watch game back then, something which I remember my late uncle letting me borrow whenever I didn't have my Game Boy. The series had no real established lore at this point, So Rare were free to take the series in whatever new direction they felt appropriate. It's honestly quite remarkable how supposedly hands-off Nintendo were during the game's development. A new redesign for Donkey Kong was provided by Rareware artist Kevin Bayliss, and the character was taken out of that old industrial urban setting and took place within a tropical island, and given a brand new villain to contend with. Instead of being the typical heroic platformer character saving the day, Donkey Kong was on a quest to retrieve his bananas. So in a way, it felt like Rare had still kept a bit of that villainous edge to the character. Donkey Kong doesn't care if the world is in peril, he just wants his bananas back. You know, just a bit of 90s chewed. The series also introduced us to many new characters. Diddy Kong, Donkey Kong's nephew and sidekick. Originally an updated redesign of Donkey Kong Jr., Diddy would become his very own character, and is practically synonymous with the franchise. Cranky Kong is the original Donkey Kong from the arcade game. Now a wise, old sage type character, Cranky would offer helpful advice and often belittle your gaming skills. He frequently trash talks all these needless fancy graphics and animations compared to the good old days. I love his sarcastic commentary in the manual, decrying all of this modern gaming. In a way, we all eventually become Cranky Kong. I'm still quite fond of all these character designs. I still remember trying to draw them from the Donkey Kong comic. I suppose the designs did start to get a little bit silly for the extended Kong family. I don't quite understand the Donkey Kong backstory actually. The cartoon mentions a ceasefire between the Kongs and King K. Rool's Kremling army.
Make them think we are participating in the ceasefire, but instead we are going to be sneaky.
So does that mean there's a war going on? Why is there an ancient Kremlin temple on the island? Did the Kong tribe take over and carve a massive face into the mountain? Why does the alligator want the bananas? I'm probably just overthinking this actually. Of course, it wasn't just about graphics, sound and character design, but Donkey Kong Country did have the great gameplay to back it up. It is still your typical platformer. Stages had a beginning and an end. Collecting 100 objects, or in this case bananas, granted you an extra life. Very typical platform game stuff, but everything just felt so fast-paced and exciting. There was often a new level gimmick introduced in every stage, which just kept things feeling fresh. The controls were so tightly designed, bouncing off enemies felt immensely satisfying. There was this rubbery sort of feel when you jumped on things, or rolled into them, or smashed them out the way. Animal buddies were there to lend you a helping hand, you know, animals riding animals, and a bevy of multiplayer options available. I remember playing the co-op mode with my sister, and we would switch between taking it in turns to complete a level. There was also a very noticeable difference in how both Donkey Kong and Diddy played. Donkey Kong was the slow-moving but strong character, whereas Diddy was much more quick and nimble, but at the cost of being unable to deal with the larger enemies. As a nod to Donkey Kong's origins, barrels frequently came into play. They could be picked up and thrown, and both the Kongs held barrels differently. Donkey Kong being able to shield himself from above, while Diddy holds barrels in front of him. Useful if you're searching for secrets. There were barrels that blasted you across levels, served as checkpoints, or teleported you to secret areas. And there were a plethora of extra secrets to discover. Secrets within secrets even, although perhaps that's just a little bit too much. The game also felt way more difficult than regular old Mario. It's actually quite challenging. Interestingly enough, the Japanese Super Famicom release did tone down some of the difficulty, and even removed a few hazards and obstacles in stages. It's still pretty tough. The general consensus online these days is that the original Donkey Kong Country is the weakest of the trilogy. Finding some of those secrets isn't exactly intuitive. A leap of faith is often required in the most inconspicuous of areas. The level design could have a few cheap moments like this. And hats off to anyone who managed to find everything in this game without the use of a guide. I couldn't do it until years later. And even if you do manage to find everything in Donkey Kong Country, there isn't really anything to unlock, aside a congratulations message from Cranky. The 101% completion rating on the file select screen is mostly just there for bragging rights. Like right here, see? I tend to actively avoid picking up those gold animal statues. It gets kind of annoying being immediately taken out of a stage and then dropped into a bonus level. The boss fights aren't terribly interesting, that is aside to a rather memorable, grueling final battle against King K. Rool himself. A lot of these flaws would be fixed in the later sequels, but I reckon the original still holds up, a few cheap moments aside. The level design often has a really nice flow. It almost feels as though Rare did intend for speedrunning. I still think it's a great game. Donkey Kong Country has been re-released numerous times over the years, including ports and unique handheld conversions. Might be fun to look at some of these a bit more in depth sometime. But nothing beats playing it on my old Super Nintendo. I honestly don't mind playing my old PAL version here. Rare were usually quite good at correctly optimizing their games for their European releases. Donkey Kong Country made me a Donkey Kong fan, and you know, it might just be my favourite Nintendo franchise of them all. So happy 30th anniversary to one of my favourite video games. Will I still be around by the time of the game's 60th anniversary, I wonder? That's a scary thought, isn't it? If you made it this far into the video, this is where I say thanks ever so much for watching, and I hope I catch you next time. Take care.